So thank you for inviting me. I am embarrassed to say that I've lived in Boston since 1975. That's 50 years. The first time I ever stepped foot in Sudbury was last week when I checked out this place before arriving. So anyway, as Francesca mentioned, the talk is called Small Town as an Ideal, as an American ideal, which it is, but it also says at times, and I will assure it gets very complicated, of what a small town has meant, or what small towns actually are now beginning to become, as a sort of an antidote both to big cities, which not too many Americans ever really liked very much, or to kind of more normal suburbia that's just become a lot less interesting, just a place full of houses as opposed to anything else. All right, so it gets complicated, so pay attention. And by the way, do people hear me back there? Okay, that's good, right. That's important because I'm not sure you'll see the images all that well. Right, so what's important about American urbanization is that it's always been this kind of oscillation. Moments when the city was gaining prominence and gaining attention and even people enjoying it, and then moments of moving away, especially during the entire 20th century, moving away to kind of the suburbs, but moving away even before then as well, as you can see. So there are moments when there are books like this, The Shame of the Cities. You could tell this is about the turn of the 19th or 20th century when industrialization was full bore, and you'll see some bad images of cities back then. And there are other moments, look, sprawl kills. In the last 25 or 30 years, there's been a lot of opposition to the, not Sudbury, but the conventional suburbs. Yeah. No, the conventional suburbs, the leather towns that were built in the 1950s and 60s in many places. And often between this sort of oscillation between our big cities okay, or our decentralization okay, the town served as a kind of a happy median, the best place for both conditions. And at the end of the lecture, I'll quote Emerson, who had the most poetic interpretation of this, if you're still around after my hour talk. But even more deeply felt than the idea of the town was the idealization of the village, the idea of the village, right? And so here's a most amazing and and not really very truthful quote. This is by Lewis Mumford, one major kind of historian of the 20th century, and he says, "Consider the village itself. Would it be an exaggeration to say that there has never been a more complete and intelligent partnership between the earth and man that existed in the old New England village?" Well, of course, it was being said around 1924 when an awful lot of villages were being depleted of their people for the lures of the big city, as, of course, the cities grew through the result of the Industrial Revolution, right? So the village, the term village is still kind of sacrosanct. There's Newton, your neighbor, sort of, right? Much larger, almost 100,000 people. It calls itself a town of 13 villages. And it still celebrates each of its, well, not all 13 of them, but some of them still celebrate a annual village day, right? Whatever that means really these days, right? There's Thomas Jefferson. Why would he call his campus, this is the University of Virginia that he designed, why would he call it an academical village? It's an interesting question. Or why would these guys, a recent design for a Wellesley Science Center, they called it a village. The hell does that have to do with the Wellesley campus, right? Well, here's another one. Look, Meadowlands Village. Do you see any meadows around? Doesn't quite look like a village, but that's what it's called because villages sell. The idea of a village sell. And by the way, throughout the 20th century, for sure, all of them that kind of looked like that had great names. Butler Heights, Sailor Ridge, Horizon Estates, and of course their commentary for something that you can read about those names, right? Fox Meadows, neither foxes or meadows in sight, right? Highland Hills, River Mist, without much mist or a river in sight, right? Now here's the biggest village of them all. Here are the villages. Perhaps some of you have visited there. That's a village the size of 150,000 people. Of course, for those of you that don't know, it's a kind of after 50 kind of retirement place in Central Florida.
Where is it?
It's Central Florida, yeah. So the summoning of ideals is really within the DNA of American culture. Not just in the kind of foundational material, in order to form a more perfect union. We've forgotten some of these, although we should still pay attention to them, especially today, right? Or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a good one. Or e pluribus unum, out of many one. Now we kind of say, no, out of many, many. And we don't talk to each other, right? Or even Herbert Hoover's famous, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, stated about a year before the Great Depression hit, unfortunately for Herbert Hoover. So the book, which I'm not going to discuss, but the book deals with this issue of the kind of ideals in American culture across history and how those ideals try to be kind of made physical in the ways in which Americans created their communities. So, hey, the term utopia is based upon the Columbian discovery of the so-called New World. And in the middle, there's just there are hundreds of maps like this. This is just a little fragment of a map from the 16th century. And Europe is up there, and of course what it says is Die Neue Welt, the New World. And then over there, there's a famous quote by an Aristotelian scholar, the discovery of America would lead to Christ, to nature, and to paradise. So that was a great expectation, a new world, unencumbered by all of the corruption and autocratic issues and all of that that was sort of a part of ancient cultures in Europe and so forth. This would be a new beginning. And so it's important to remember, although we tend to forget this, is that if you read the top there, an idea about America preceded the arrivals to America, not of course the indigenous populations. So the idea about what America should be preceded the arrival of those. And of course another kind of famous philosopher said, in the beginning all the world was America. It was new and therefore could begin anew, and presumably in a kind of a happier way, more just, more free, and on and on. And hundreds of people, hundreds of communities coming here out of persecution or particular religious beliefs and so forth arrived. They're the Shakers, right? And they did shake, by the way. They trembled more than they shook as an expression of their prayers, right? But the Quakers, the Catholics, the Huguenots, the Moravians, the Amish, and just a few of the hundreds of such groups who came and created villages, kind of almost seeking not necessarily the original paradise, but to create a bit of paradise for themselves and their beliefs, and bound together by common beliefs in a sort of a village-like setting. And of course, some of the Shaker villages are now tourist attractions around actually this region. Well, back to the villages, I have to introduce a couple more words that are critical to the rest of the talk, right? So here's an ad for the villages, and it says below, welcome to our hometown. So the idea of a hometown is very central to this idea about a proper American settlement. We all like to believe we're living in hometowns, not a metropolis or a region or something like that, right? And then of course the hometown means homes. So here's a very important mid-19th century quotation that was often produced, right? The home, having a domestic spirit of grace dwelling in it. The home having grace dwelling spirit in it should become the church of childhood, the table and heart, a holy site. The home being a holy site, right? And of course, Thomas Jefferson certainly believed in that, and he imagined a whole empire, an agrarian republic, actually, where each of us, well, not the indigenous populations or the slaves, each of us could acquire for themselves a homestead, right, 160 acres, a quarter section of land, upon which we could then create our life in sort of freedom and liberty and independence and so forth, right? And of course, that idea, of course, was central also into the 19th century. I'm going to go across the centuries quickly, right, to get back to the idea of what towns represented and why they're making a great comeback, actually, which is the end of the talk. So, of course, the Transcendentalists were very much part of this idea of homes hometowns, but in their case also somehow being kind of still in what they called a nature's nation. It's funny to say that term now, but of course at the beginning of the 19th century there was a belief that here, as opposed to kind of overgrown Europe and so forth, a nation devoted to nature could still be maintained in these beautiful little towns. Now, but during the second half of the 19th century, guess what? That's a view of Chicago. By the hundreds of thousands of homesteaders and many, many town residents left left to just kind of empty, right? Those homesteads and towns to get to the big city, where, of course, new opportunities, new possibilities for modernizing America could be had. It wasn't just immigrants from abroad. There were immigrants from the rest of the country flooding a place like Chicago. So if you remember this passage here, right, by Mumford about, right, the most intelligent partnership, written in 1924, a couple of years earlier, some of you might remember a Main Street, a book by Sinclair Lewis, and this is the way he describes the hometown of Carol, the principal protagonist. It was a street at the end of the world, beyond the boundaries of hope. Though she should sit here forever, no brave procession. No one who was interesting would be coming by. It was the town. Tediousness made tangible. A street builded of transition, of lassitude, and of futility. It was the town for Carol. Sounds like any 20-year-old right now, by the way, hoping to get themselves to the big city, right? It was dullness made God. So about the same era, there was on the one hand still this kind of sentimental appeal of the idea of a town, a hometown, and then Sinclair Lewis a bit with less sentimentality, seeing, of course, this escape from the town, talking about the town being, or Carol's town. I don't remember actually a town that's set in the novel. Dullness made God. All right. But as we move towards the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, the incredible inhumanity of of Chicago or New York, and for those of you who might have ever read Charles Dickens about mid-19th century London, they were not so pleasant places, as you can see, right? So as the inhumanity of the big modern city became more evident, a response emerges, a solution emerges. We now call them suburbs, but originally they were thought to be new towns, new small towns, freed from the rasping frictions of the big city, right? And while we think of the suburb as a kind of mid-20th century idea, they existed, at least for the upper middle classes, from the middle of the 20th century. And it's not important to read these quotes, you can't read them anyway, but they all talk about what a great idea this was, as opposed to a Chicago. And and that one is just one of them, right? The controversy that is sometimes brought as to which offers the greatest advantage, the country or the city, finds a happy answer in the suburban idea. Not saying suburban as we think of the suburbs today, but as a solution to, of course, the inhumanity of the industrial city. And there are various books, like the one on top, called The Suburban Trend, and of course it was quite a trend, right? And then as we hit into the beginning of the 20th century, this is actually a federal poster. At the time, around World War I, at the time when there was fear that communism would spread across the ocean, and so long as people owned their homes and their land, there would never be communism or socialism here, right? So this was part of something called the Own Your Own Home campaign from the federal government. And there he is, right? The man who owns his home is a better worker, a better husband, a better father, a better citizen, and a real American. Yes?
Isn't it a class distinction here? I mean, who could afford to go to the suburbs and have this?
Well, but for a while, almost everybody I'm about to get there, all right?
Levittown.
Yeah, right, exactly. So anyway, it's not as if Americans just were born to love the suburb. It was actually ingrained a bit by, of course, culture and actually subsidization. Of course, we now need some for cities, but that's a different topic. So between as we move kind of closer to our own time, right, between the Great Depression, well, it's no longer our own time, but and World War II, for those 20 years, very little investment took place in cities. Not during the Depression, not during World War II. We had other problems, right? And so they were left to kind of be sort of, slummed, as they were then called. And this is a cover of an organization called the Resettlement Administration. Think about that. That sounds kind of Trumpian, actually, right? The Resettlement Administration, founded by FDR, and the Resettlement Administration was trying to bring the economy back through construction. And so a series of small towns were built. 20 were planned, but 3 were built. Close enough for government work, somebody might say. But of course, look at this posting. Life by the acre is what's appealing. You should know that. Life by the square foot is kind of dark and dingy, right? And sure enough, right, then with the next couple of decades, and especially during the kind of what are sometimes still called the eras of prosperity, of the kind of exponential growth of the American middle class, Mr. Levitt and others like him began to produce these things by the hundreds of thousands. And this was a form of federal subsidization as well. That's what we no longer remember, right? But at least by these 4 policies, right? The invention of the low interest, long-term mortgage, that was from the 1930s. The federal tax code, which then allows you to deduct your interest. You can't do that if you're renting. Think about what a great incentiment that is for ownership, right? And actually you could call it, right, a support for suburbanization. The GI Bill, obviously, for all the veterans, not just in terms of almost making housing free, virtually, as well as education. And then, of course, the investment in all the infrastructure that was necessary to make Mr. Levitt able to do what he was doing, right? Highways, sewerage systems, electricity, telegrams, and so forth, right? So we forget that the suburb was not a natural condition. It actually was subsidized by public policies. And look at this headline. Find a similar headline anywhere in America right now, right? Low-priced homes suitable for any wage earner. Find such a headline in any American newspaper these days. And it was true, because for virtually little amount of sort of investment with these fabulous long-term mortgages, you could, like this family, right, own a home. Just like, well, not on 160 acres, not quite a homestead, but hey, own a home and achieve the American dream. So as, of course, by the millions of Americans that were moving from cities, by now older industrial cities, right, moving to places like Levittown, and even places like Sudbury. I'll show you that kind of history of oscillation, comparing actually Boston to Sudbury, believe it or not, right, in a second, right? The urban renewal era emerged as a way to go back into the cities and solve them, largely by demolishing their centers. And occasionally it was called Negro removal, which is not far from the truth as well, right? Pardon?
Where did they go when they removed them?
No, they stayed. It was called white flight. All of us white folks, they stayed, right? Well, they were removed because of the demolitions of many neighborhoods. Yes, right.
I just think it's worth saying that the redlining that occurred after the GI Bill,
Yeah.
so you could be a black veteran,
Yeah.
You couldn't get
Right.
benefits.
Up until the night.
Really when
Yeah.
this whole thing is
Yeah.
really when that really
Yeah.
got
And does everybody know what redlining was? Actually, it was not. It was originally, and I'm going to go off topic here and keep you here much too long, but the redlining originally was not nefarious. It was used nefariously. The red line was a way for banks to try to assess which portions of the city were more in better shape, for lack of a better word, right? More susceptible to kind of investment through these low-cost, long-term mortgages. The problem was, if you turn to minority neighborhoods, they weren't so seemingly good for investment, and that therefore 318 maps were produced coding each city: red, brown, and green. There's a fourth color, right? And the red line was around those neighborhoods that were not fit to be invested in, and guess what? They were almost 100%. A few kind of European immigrant kind of communities, but the vast majority were, of course, black neighborhoods, right? Yes. So it was by the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, it was called white flight, in part. So here's a demonstration. You can't see the numbers, but I'm going to compare Boston to Sudbury in terms of a period, 2 periods, right? So, by the way, you may not know, Boston was almost over 800,000 people around 1960. By 1980, it was down to 563,000. By the way, that was not even as bad as St. Louis or Detroit or Cleveland or many other so-called Rust Belt cities. They were being emptied. And then, of course, the urban renewal period then started to kind of demolish what was left in order to what? To create the kind of the bankers and kind of world leaders and so forth in Manhattan to reinvest, finally, in cities, right? So, and this, of course, is a picture of the West End, and then it was completely demolished, and something called Charles River Park was built. It still is there, obviously. Charles River Park, a nice place to live, as opposed to, this kind of slummy area of tenements, right? So, whoops, I'm going backwards, which is not good. So, in the upper box is the period between around 1870 and 1910 or something like that, 1920, right? That's when, of course, people were leaving hometowns and villages and so forth, and even Sudbury, for the big city, right? So Boston, the stuff on the left, the circle on the left with the plus sign, was rapidly gaining population, right? It was an industrial kind of behemoth in its time, right? Sudbury was losing population for the same reason. People wanted to go to Boston to get the new jobs or become bankers or whatever, right? So that's the kind of second half of the 19th century. Now it's reversed then in the box below, in the kind of it's the second half of the 19th century, if you will, starting around 1950, right? Boston was shedding population, going from 800 to 500,000 people. Sudbury was growing amazingly. Look at that. In 1960, right? 186% in those 10 years. I mean, it really was a village-sized back before the middle of the 20th century. And it's kept growing a little bit, right? So you can see that, there's this kind of, as Boston grew, Sudbury shrank. As Boston diminished in size in this first half, Sudbury grew. Much more so than probably you would allow today. I don't think you would vote for 186% population increase in the next 10 years in Sudbury, right? I mean, would anyone be supportive of that in this audience? Right. Okay. So the second half actually produced what we now called, or these planners and pundits and so forth, sprawl. No longer the promise of the suburb, but sprawl as a negative term. And in case you think it's about Sudbury, no. Let me show you sprawl. We're going to go to Baltimore for just a little while, for 2 minutes or so. So there's Baltimore, the 6th largest city in America in 1900. Population around 500,000 people. There it is. Each dot is a home or property, not a property, right? So there are single homes around. There are little villages, and so forth. But, most people lived in 1900 in Baltimore, right? That's where the density was. I won't show you every 10 years, but we'll start again in 1940. So just to compare, right? Well, okay, Baltimore grew, but you can also start seeing other places growing as well. Okay, but now let's go decade by decade. So here's 1950, 1960, 1970. By the way, the area below is actually outskirts of Washington, D.C., right? 1980, 1990, and 2000. That's astonishing, right? Look at that. It's actually, you can use a kind of a medical, it's like cancer metastasizing in one's body, except across, of course, the landscape. So, sorry, so, whoops. So here it is, a century earlier, and here it is, and I'm not going to show you 2010, 2020. It gets even worse, right? So actually sprawl and this idea about not the traditional homestead or that great village that Lewis Mumford regaled everyone about, but in fact the idea of the suburban experience is a problem, actually, is a problem. And so towards the end, and of course Baltimore, huge sections of Baltimore actually are still, Boston has sort of papered this over recently because Boston has grown. Boston has been Phoenix-like and has recovered from when it looked like this around 1960. But sections of Baltimore still do. All right, so somehow, as a consequence of this, there was this other kind of a set of concerns or intentions or goals, the beginnings of environmentalism in the 1960s, actually a bit stronger it seems to be today in some circles, and cartoons like this, right? This bear saying, "Your yard is starting to mess with my living room." True. And so ideas about how to grow smarter began to emerge, and growing smarter meant actually trying to shift away from this sort of suburban ideal. And remember, the suburb was supposed to be a town to overcome, of course, the industrial city, right, which was uninhabitable. And so in the 1980s and 90s, beginning in the 80s, this kind of idea about new towns began to kind of become popular, and the most exceptional version of this, it was designed by Walt Disney. Well, the Disney Corporation by that time. I don't know whether any of you with your kids or your grandkids have been to, I guess, Disney World, not Disney World in Florida, and then happen to take a half a day to see Celebration. Anyone? Anyone have been to Celebration? Ah, okay. Well, you can correct me what I'm about to say. So there it is, right? And below is just a small piece of the kind of marketing for it, right? Remember that place. Perhaps from childhood, or maybe just from stories. It held a magic all of its own, the special magic of an American hometown. There it is. And actually, it's in some ways a quick pass-through. Makes you believe that almost. It's charming. The streets are charming. You can see. It's not even only single-family homes. There are sort of little townhomes and so forth, right? There's a little downtown. By the way, Disney, the company has disinvested from this years ago now. They finally figured out that managing cartoon characters is easier than managing an actual town. So it still is an unincorporated community now. Some developers control it. So there's Main Street, right? And there's a piece of it, right? There's another view of it. Look at the nice folks occupying Celebration. There are celebrators in Celebration, as you would expect, I guess. And actually, the Great American Pie Festival takes place with some frequency there, as of course you would expect in a great town. And there's even snow that falls in Florida, although you can see folks aren't quite dressed for that yet. It is artificial. This is when Disney was still in charge, right? There would be an annual snowfall pouring from rooftops and light posts onto the good citizens who were enjoying snow in their summer clothing. Right? Now, did celebration or dozens and dozens of kind of other examples like this solve sprawl? No. Look at the rest of this, just, celebrations down there, but the rest of Central Florida is one big sprawl mess, right? So something had to change in the culture as part of this sort of changing trends, changing attitudes, changing kind of convictions, oscillating. I don't know how many of you ever read Zippy. He's still around. He's a great cartoonist, in my opinion. And there he is in 2001. Somehow the change in the millennium began to kind of change perspectives and actually changed economies and other things as well. Look at that. What's good for you? A town, a city actually, a main street, right? Big, tall buildings, 4 or 5 stories. What's bad for you? A suburban shopping strip or something, right? Drawn in a not very attractive way, right? You could fill a library with books that came out between around 1990 and 2010, so about cities, how wonderful cities are after all of that, how wonderful cities are. Boston Magazine, right? City living is back. An urban zip code. Another book title I don't think made it here. The urban zip code is now important, right? Not a Sudbury zip code. Right? Cool cities, and on, bomb the suburbs. Really, entire kind of libraries were produced, right? Oh, by the way, and they discovered that sex was in the cities. If there's no sex ever in the suburbs, right? And you might remember, it was a very popular television program, right? So there's this change, this kind of cultural change, which occasionally happens, somehow on behalf now of the city. Not the damn sprawling suburb that's everywhere and nowhere and so forth, right? And another very important book, it's still very much in print, that just completely infected every mayor and Chamber of Commerce director in America, called The Rise of the Creative Class. What's the creative class? Well, they're all the folks who work in the digital age and at Amazon and so forth. Of course, where do they congregate, right? Where does the creative class congregate? Well, in cities. Boston now has a lot of these folks, right? An awful lot of these folks, right? And even sort of these, I'm sure there's some around here, right? These sort of 60s, 70s, 80s suburban office parks, which was the move of work to the suburbs. They were moving there, what? In search of laborers who were out in the suburbs. This is a case where jobs were following people. Once the suburbs were out there, of course, the jobs wanted to get close to them. People always say, oh no, we follow jobs. People follow jobs. Occasionally, the opposite happens, as was the case during this kind of mad suburbanization period. But in recent years, here's Amazon headquarters, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in replacing its suburban office park into downtown Seattle, right? They built 18 buildings this large there, right? McDonald's has moved from the suburbs outside of Chicago into kind of closer to the city. McDonald's, the kind of archetypal, say, suburban experience, right? So something was in the air, all right? Something in the air that Zippy predicts, and these books wrote about, and these new kinds of folks were now populating urban areas. And these corporations, by the way, there's been so much protest against Amazon Seattle that they're moving back out into areas somewhat, all right? But that's, again, a different topic for a different day, right? And there was even a perfume called Urban Decay. I wonder whether any of you women would if I brought some, would you be interested in that particular cosmetic, right? So again, Urban Decay as a perfume. So,
It's a lot of makeup.
right. So the point is, there was this shift after a century of suburbanization and preferring the kind of decentralized existence, of course, dating back all the way to Jefferson and prior, right? Now, what wasn't being realized, however, and especially by house builders, the home building industry, was, see, So what percentage of households in America are families? That is, two parents, that could be, two men or two female, and two kids not yet in college, that is still, kind of grade school or high school. What percentage of households in America, would you guess, constitute the family?
Under 50%.
Yeah, you're close. You're not close enough, right? So a century ago, it was thought to be 55, 60, maybe 70%. Households are families. Well, depending upon which demographer you believe in, it's somewhere between 18% and 23%. The suburb was invented for the family. But look at this. But all of these young people who are staying young much longer than their parents, much less their grandparents, and all of us kind of, empty nesters, and I bet there are a few of you in the room. I won't point to anybody, right? We've got decades to go after our kids grow up. And neither this group or this group initially thinks of, a condo on the 4th floor of, a suburban home, right? Necessarily. These want to be in cities where they meet people like themselves and they, go work for Google and so forth. And, this couple doesn't want to mow their lawn anymore. So that's an amazing kind of statistic which we're sort of unaware of. So the suburb, which is supposed to be for all of us because we were all parts of families, are now a very substantial minority. So again, for those groups, life by the square foot is not so bad, if you can afford it. But of course, for the family, life by the acre still seems like a good idea. A house and a yard and a secure neighborhood and a better public school system and so forth, right? So that shift from 50%, which may have been the case maybe 30 years ago still, to 18% is an enormous shift. So it's one of the reasons, one of the unstated reasons for why the cost of housing has exploded, because 80% of the population, 80% of households are not as interested in the archetypal suburban experience, right? So yes, another great cartoon. By the way, I think cartoonists get to the point much quicker than urban pundits. They do. So there's what is being listed, right? And there's what you should, right? What it's sold for, right? Now, again, this change in family, in lifestyles, right, is part of the problem. There's a long list, and I won't go through this. You probably are aware of some of them, and some of you who are closer can read some of these. There's a long reason why housing has begun sort of exponentially to grow. Part of it is the move back to kind of urban territories and away from the typical suburb. But it's the cost of construction, it was the pandemic, it was inflation, it was all kinds of things, right? It was opposition to growth in outlying areas, the so-called NIMBY movement, which is still fairly strong in some parts of the country, right? Not in my backyard, that's what NIMBY stands for, right? There's great opposition to, in other words, again, you don't want to grow by 186% in Sudbury. I'm pretty sure about that, right? So there are many, many reasons, but one of those is this kind of funny situation about how few families there are these days for whom the suburb is still an ideal, versus for these guys and those guys who are looking for different kind of experiences, right? And by the way, my son, who actually some of you met, he was just here, but he didn't want to hang around for the lecture, and I can't blame him. He's 30. He may, knock on wood, he may live to be 100. Knock on wood and hope to God and so forth, right? Think about that. Again, as opposed to 100 years ago. So what was the meaning of that? Actually, the percentage of his life dedicated to family rearing is not much different than it was. Women can't give birth very easily in their 40s, much less 50s or 60s, right? So the percentage of a much longer life of family rearing keeps getting smaller. And that's why, again, the kind of 80% of households are interested in a greater variety of housing types, which the home building industry is not yet producing. And cities and towns, and especially suburban towns, are not so eager to help in the situation, or many of them. All right. And so, of course, since the 1960s and increasing the annual construction of homes, some apartments, of course, not just homes, has been decreasing substantially. And that's another reason, that's one of the major reasons, of course, why there's this kind of housing crunch. So that's where the kind of this, I don't know how many know this slogan. It tends to be true of younger people who have now gotten a great job in downtown Boston and have moved from Michigan or something and cannot freaking believe that they have to still, in their 30s, have to live with 3 other couples in an apartment that, is still outrageous, right? So drive till you qualify. You know what that means, right? You drive until you can afford a mortgage. Now, I'm not pointing the arrows in any particular way, right? But it's a real thing amongst that, those young couples that were appearing right here in that trilogy, right? Well, sometimes on that drive, you might land in Haverhill. And guess what? Haverhill, as this says, living in Haverhill is cool now. It's not Boston. It's not some damn suburb just full of houses and nothing else. It has a little bit of both. And guess what? A place like Haverhill, and there are many such places in the larger metropolitan area, are now first of all, you've driven perhaps enough to where you might afford a smaller condo or something, are actually growing a bit, growing a little bit faster than the big city, which is unaffordable, or actually, some suburban areas as well, right? So this is where the idea of the town as an ideal once more it reappears, but not by new designs of new places, but by rediscovering the benefits of a town with suburban features to it, as opposed to the town thought about as a suburb 150 years ago, or the kind of the traditional towns of 200-300 years ago, actually like Sudbury, right? So here I end with one more ideal, and Mr. Emerson, who apparently spent a little bit of time, at least along your famous inn here, right? And here's what he said very poetically, but I think an awful lot of Americans kind of unconsciously believed, right? I wish for rural strength and religion and city facility and polish. Emerson, unlike his buddy Thoreau, didn't hang out in Concord all the time. He actually was he traveled very frequently, including to Europe, right? He hung around Concord some. So I wish for rural strength and religion and city facility and polish. It's a kind of a hidden interest on the part of many people who would want some semblance of city facility and polish near them, but also, if you say maybe modernize those words, a kind of cosmopolitan experience in an actual town-like, much less city-like involvement, right? And by the way, in a funny way, he might have even been quoting Horace, Rome's lyrical poet, 2,000 years ago, who said, oh, by the way, I forgot. This actually is a new subdivision. It looks awful, but it's called Emerson Ridge, in honor of Emerson. But there's no ridge, right? All right, but that's actually in Dover, New Hampshire, which I'm going to talk to you about in 1 second, and then I'm going to stop, right? Okay, but back to Horace here, right? In Rome, you long for the country, oh, inconstant. In the country, you praise the distant city to the stars. So there's again this, actually, for Emerson, it was a kind of a lament. He couldn't find such a place. But if he was around today, he might wish to live in Haverhill, actually, or a place like Haverhill, right? Look, well, first of all, it's reasonably sized now, and it's been growing. It's been growing and growing and growing, right? And look, it looks like a fine kind of urban experience. Not exactly a shopping mall. Well, there are plenty of them all around and so forth, right? I'm carefully editing these photographs for you, you must understand, right? But still, right? And so there it is. It it grew a lot, right? It never lost a substantial amount of population, and it's growing again considerably, actually growing much faster now than Boston, despite all this kind of talk about how Boston's growing again, and that's one of the reasons why it's becoming so unaffordable. And actually, Haverhill happens to be along two transit lines, the commuter line and I don't know how many of you ever take the Downeaster. I do now because we have a little escape in Dover, New Hampshire, which I'm going to talk to you about for 1 second, right? So two transit lines that get you to Haverhill. So the new American small town, as this publication talked about, right, is saying, hey, the new town is not Mumford's town. It's not Sinclair Lewis's town, but it now tries to provide what Emerson wished for, right? And conditions in American culture right now accelerate that a little bit, right? The pandemic did, and even the fear, the new fear of maybe congestion, too much congestion breeds, maybe will breed subsequent pandemics and so forth, right? Climate change will affect Boston even more quickly than, at least sea level rise, than Miami, because most of Boston's land is produced. It was essentially an island when it was first settled, right? The kind of the work from home phenomenon, which is not going away. You don't have to go down to, the financial district in Boston is still dead these days by comparison to what it looked like in terms of pedestrian activity 5 years ago now, right? And even the fact that stuff comes to us now. We don't have to go in search of things quite as often, and that will not decrease in time. So there are conditions that actually support the possibility of creating, well, something that Emerson hoped he would find. A nice place that has a certain number of kind of civic or cosmopolitan charm and amenities, but still away from, again, this risping fractions of the big city and close enough to kind of a more pastoral environment of not necessarily, a half acre or a quarter acre or 2 acre lot for yourself. Yes?
So a friend of mine yesterday was talking about Haverhill.
There you
It
go.
used to be the shoe capital.
I must have talked to him.
It was a woman, my friend Priscilla, she said Stuart Weitzman, who makes very expensive shoes, he's going to head up the museum they're renovating there for New England antiquities. So that's going to really
Yes.
increase it even more.
Yes, and there are other places like this. So and again, this kind of oh gosh, who's the former mayor, the very rich former mayor of New York, Michael Bloom, right? He runs a kind of giant think tank and so forth. And this is from this think tank. This is a couple of years ago, right? Nearly half of Americans now prefer small town or rural living. Well, that was always true, by the way. It's just the suburbs seem to be the way to get there, right? But last year, and this is 2002, I think, last year, new businesses launched in non-urban areas grew 20% faster than in urban areas. So there's a new movement out there that sort of gets us back to the ideal of a town, although a town that is maybe a little bit different than the original towns, but still has that kind of charm and sentimentality and well-being associated with it, right? So my firm merged with a large firm, and instead of becoming a partner in this larger firm 10 years ago, I took the money. Now, there's not a lot of money to be had in running a small architecture firm. Don't get too excited, right? But it allowed I'm a city slicker, but my wife is calls herself a country mouse. And to get her finally out of living in the damn city, we bought a little property in Dover, New Hampshire. Don't know how many of you have been there. It was, a major industrial town, way back, right? There's a kind of image of the downtown area. Dover is growing immensely, partially because it's cheaper still than, of course, Portsmouth, which of course is just as bad as Boston, and of course tourist overrun, right? So a place that's 10 miles away from Portsmouth is now profiting in a way, right, or benefiting in a way by growing. This is what's under construction in Dover right now. Fortunately, not next to our property, but look at that. They're building 400 units. Some of them are condominiums, going to be condos. Many of them are apartments, right? So here it is, another example of Dover, just a kind of little podunk town in southern New Hampshire. Now is sort of reaping the benefits of becoming more town-like and therefore a place that maybe Emerson would want to live in, where he's still around. Now, this gets me to Sudbury. Congratulations, you're one of 177 towns identified by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as being near transit. Although I saw your transit stop on my tour last week, right? But again, I knew I would get a laugh before the end of the talk. But still, actually, Sudbury has complied, at least you know, in the statement, complying to this requirement now that 177 communities in and around Metro Boston now have to adjust their zoning in one area to accommodate multifamily housing. It's a good idea. The majority of towns have agreed. I'm not sure all this housing has started construction yet, but they've consented to adapting their zoning. About 10% still are, suing the Commonwealth. And you could even identify maybe some of the towns that would. Milton was one of them for sure, yeah. I won't tell you the others, but right. So you've complied. And so I tried to find, and by the way, you have a couple of examples of multifamily housing, I think Francesca showed me. And there's a new zoning code that I believe, I'm not positive, I hope some of you might tell me, that a new overlay district that will accommodate some multifamily housing. And I think that's great. I couldn't find it on your zoning map, but perhaps I didn't have the most up-to-date zoning map. All the white, all the green is all single-family zoning. And of course, it should remain that way. But certainly, if you want to become the next Haverhill, someplace, and maybe close to that transit stop, because maybe at some point, there's a lot of open land around there, by the way, at least as I noticed, and maybe it will accelerate the frequency of transit times there, and maybe Sudbury also can adapt to this new ideal of a town, which you are, that might offer this sort of combination of Emerson's wish of rural strength and religion and a little bit of city facility and polish. I will stop there.